Now that we've got our engine mount situation sorted out, we've got to figure out what we're going to do about the oil pan. As you guys might know, most junkyard LSs have a rear sump oil pan. It's made out of aluminum. It's a really good unit. It holds a lot of oil, but it won't necessarily work on our application. I'm going to show you guys why. Mopars actually use what's called a mid-sump pan, which means that the sump, or wherever the majority of the oil capacity is going to be towards the center of the engine, or really towards the center front of the engine. So whereas the LS has it in the rear, the Mopars have it in the middle. Functionally wise, the mid sump and the rear sump pans don't have a huge difference. A lot of times they just change the sump location depending on how the cars are designed. For example, the Fords have the front, the Mopars have the middle, and the Chevys have the rear. In a drag racing application, the oil tends to fall back, and so a rear sump pan tends to be the best option for that. Why Mopar decided to go with the mid sump pan, I have no idea, but we're gonna have to figure out a way to install the rear sump pan into a mid sump pan car. Now if we go underneath the car, we should be able to see kind of what we're working with here. We can see the back of the block over here. The middle of the block is where this X is, and then we have the front of the block, which sits right here. So in a typical Mopar application, the sump is going to sit like right here towards the front middle really, and on the LS's it'll sit back here. And as you can see, there's a huge bar because of the steering arm. Now I have a couple options here. I can either make a mid sump pan work for this car, or I can make a rear sump pan work with this car. And because we're going to be doing road racing, drag racing, and a bunch of other stuff, a rear sump pan is just going to be a better option versus having to modify a mid sump pan and then worry about oil starvation issues in the future. So with that in mind, this is what I ended up picking up. This is a universal sheet metal pan that I picked up online. You can get these for pretty cheap. This was just over $100 or so, maybe 150 bucks. And it's a completely sheet metal pan. It looks like it's stamped steel on top with the reinforced rail, and then it's got a fabricated sump. Inside the sump, we've got a little container here for oil to come down. It'll come down into these holes. These holes will feed to this little chamber, and then there's a little trap door here, so as oil comes to the back, it fills up the sump. Under hard acceleration, it'll yank the oil out of that little chamber and bring it into the sump. And then under braking and stopping and hard cornering, this little trap door will close, and it'll try to keep all the oil in here. The problem is that this is a rear sump typical LS configuration, and we have that steering arm that'll end up somewhere right here. I mentioned that on the Mopars, we have a mid to front sump pan, and so the steering arm ends up somewhere right here. If I try to put the pan underneath the mock-up engine, I still need another 2 or 2.5 inches for this pan to scoot forward, and that's where the steering arm is contacting against the sump. So here's my idea. As you can see, we've got a pretty straight steering arm right here, but toward the ends, it actually scoots the bar back. So it comes out this way, moves it to the back of the car. If we continue this bar to the other side, it has the opposite problem. So right now the bar is offset toward the back. I'm positive that if I undo these tie rods, I could actually flip or turn this rod around completely and then reinstall the ball joints, flipping this bar from pointing to the back to pointing to the front. That should probably net me about 1 inch or 1.5 inches of clearance. So I'll go ahead and try that first and then remeasure to see how much more clearance we're gonna need. Alright, so I just pulled the tie bar from underneath the car. As you can see, it's not a perfectly symmetrical bar. It looks like on this side it's got a little bit more of a swoop, and on this one it's a little bit more flat. And then you can see this curve that points toward the back. If we flip this around and we run it like this, then this little swoop ends up on the passenger side, and this somewhat straight section ends up on the driver's side. I'm just trying to gain a little bit more clearance by flipping this bar around, but we'll have to see if that little swoop makes a big difference or not when it comes to steering. Either way, I'm going to reassemble it right now and test it out. Okay, so I've reinstalled the tie bar, and now I'm under here with the oil pan, and I've got the sump butted up against the tie bar, and you can see where the 2 bolt holes are supposed to be. That's like almost 2 inches about between the hole on the left to the hole on the right, but I've got no more adjustment here, and I've already flipped around the tie bar. So what I'm going to do instead, I'm going to seat this all the way up against the block, and I'm going to mark right here on the pan just to let me know where the tie bar is. And then it looks like we're going to have to flip the tie bar back the other way and start cutting the pan. We are back on the table. As you can see, I've marked out where the tie bar goes, or about more or less of where I think the tie bar should go. I kind of just got the pan up against the bar and just ran my marker through there and then try to reach around and go out the other way. So it's not very scientific at all, but it gives you a general idea. I did start here on this side and it ended up getting wider as we went along. So we're gonna use this side as a reference. I also measured from this back bolt to the distance on the mock-up block, and it ended up being about 3 1/4 inches. That would be this mark right here. So then I measured 3 1/4 inches from here to that way, and then I added half the distance of the thickness of the tie bar, which is the tie bar is 1 inch, half of that is 1/2 inch. So we're at 3 3/4 inch from the sump, and then I ran some lines from here out that way using my square. This line ends up being about right there. This line is right here. Half of that distance is right there. So now that I know that the tie bar will be sitting exactly right here, I've got to figure out what my options are. If I put the bar back in reverse, I'll save myself another inch, inch and a half or so. So the bar will move from here to there, which honestly doesn't really change too much. You still have to find a way to notch out the oil pan, and if you're gonna notch it with the bar one way or the other way, then you might as well just leave the bar in its proper location. So that's what I did. I put the bar back the way it's supposed to be, and so that's where these marks ended up. The next option is I can just move the sump from here and then turn it into a center sump pan. I don't like that idea at all. I don't think it's going to be very useful. Although the car will work and it'll run and it'll drive, I feel like with any kind of performance driving, I'm going to run into problems. So I'd much rather not turn this into a mid sump pan. So what I think I'm going to do instead, I'm going to take a hole saw. This is a 2-inch hole saw, and I'm just going to center punch this hole, and I'm going to drill a pilot right here in the middle and then run the hole saw through and then try to center it between this line and that line. Using a 2-inch or even maybe a 2.5-inch hole saw, that should give me enough room to put a new piece of tube in here, and then I could weld around that tube and then run the tie bar through that tube. The only problem with doing that is that now the area for the pickup tube becomes severely reduced. As you can see, this was the area for the pickup. If you run a 2 or 2.5-inch pipe across here, there's not a lot of area for this oil to come back in here. Not only that, the addition of the 2.5-inch pipe would also take up a lot of oil capacity. And 3, even if I put a tube through here, I need to make sure that when I cycle the suspension, the tie bar doesn't start off here and then ends up over here somewhere. Think of this as a tie bar, and as it cycles with the pitman arm, it'll get closer and further away from the oil pan. My mistake was not to measure the distance between the tie bar and the factory oil pan that was in the car before, because that would have given me an idea of how far the bar was going to travel. So instead of trying to guesstimate where that bar is going to be, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to take the sump off completely from the oil pan. So we're going to take this top weld and we're going to cut right along it all the way around, and then we're just going to completely remove the sump off of the rest of the sheet metal pan. Once I have the sump removed, then I can put this on the engine, and I'll be able to cycle the steering and mark where the bar starts and then where the bar ends. And that'll give me an idea of whether or not I can put the sump back on and just drill the hole, or if I'm gonna need to come up with a different idea. Well, that only took 2 minutes. It was just 4 welds that went all the way across, and the whole thing just plopped off. In fact, if I really wanted to, I could just move the whole sump forward, and there we go. Now it's a Mopar sump. And if I move the sump all the way to the front, now it's a Ford sump or a van sump or whatever. At this point, I can move the sump wherever I want and it'll work. The only thing I would have to do is just plug this backside. And it might actually be the easiest thing to do, but I'm gonna go ahead and take the top part of the pan and then compare it to the engine block, and then I'll be able to mark the travel of the steering arm. All right, so we are now back under the car. I've got the sumpless pan under here bolted onto the mock-up block, and I've got the tie bar sitting here in its neutral position. So we're gonna go ahead and mark the center of it, or at least as close as I can to the center. So that's gonna be like right here. So now we're going to move the arm, we're gonna cycle it, and then we're gonna do another line to mark its center line. And now if we look at the 2 marks, we can see that it travels about 2 inches or so front to back or back to front. Now that we have a general idea of where we're at, I can kind of come up with the game plan. So after much deliberation, I've decided that I'm actually going to go ahead and turn this oil pan into a mid-sump oil pan. It's just the quickest and easiest way to get this thing on the road. And if it's designed properly, I shouldn't have any issues. After all, classic Mopars are all pretty much mid-sump, and very few engine failures have been the result of the mid-sump oil pan. So although it's not ideal, I would really much rather use a rear sump. I really don't have another choice unless I convert the car to rack and pinion and I scoot everything forward. But that's not something I'm ever going to tackle, at least not in the near future. I've also trimmed out the corners of the pop-outs because these were hitting the steering linkage. I'd much rather cut the oil pan versus the K-member, so that's a no-brainer. Cut out the pop-outs. I did cut out a little too much right here. I cut it out in a 90-degree and it was supposed to be cut at an angle, so I could just put a sheet metal plug here, another sheet metal plug there, and call it good. But I'm going to need to install the sheet metal plug and then fit in a little triangle and then shave that all down, make it look nice and pretty. I went ahead and I also marked the pan, and basically the outside line is where this pan sits. I'm using this as a guide and just giving myself a little flange all the way around. So I'm giving myself about a 1/4 inch of flange on the sides, about a 1/2 inch toward the front, and then about 1 inch toward the back. And that inch is going to kind of overhang about right here, and that's going to keep the oil from coming back up and getting on top of here. Another idea that had occurred to me is that when the sump is properly welded in and everything, the steering linkage still sits pretty darn low. If you look closely, you can still see the marks that I put from where we measured where the steering linkage was traveling across. I still have over 1 inch of distance between this area and the area on top of the steering linkage. So what I was thinking is I could cut out the rest of this all the way up to the weld seam. Then I can install some sheet metal about 1 inch down, starting from 0. That way it kind of gives it like a funnel, putting the oil back into the oil pan. I'm sure that would help guide the oil better than if I was to make this completely flat again. I think I finally got all the puzzle pieces in order. So we've got our sump here, and I cleaned up some of the burrs on the edges, so it should be safe to hold. That guy just kind of sits there more or less. And then I made this guy. This is the new bottom, and this one will go about right here. I didn't use anything special, just some rusted out sheet metal that I had out in the back. Should work fine. So as soon as I get this bolted down to my extra block, I should be able to use that as my straight edge. Then I'll be able to tack everything together here and there, make sure everything is nice and tight. Once that's all good, I can test fit it on the engine, and if that looks good, then I'll finish welding everything and put the caps on the corners, and then we'll be done with the oil pan. Now that I've got those tacks on there, I bolted the pan back to the bottom of the engine, and this time it actually fits. The sump is right here in the middle. I've only got a few tack welds in the corner. I've got that little ramp toward the back. I've got plenty of room between the oil pan and the link. The drag link is actually fully extended to, I want to say, the passenger side. And so if I bring the link back to center, I should have even more room between the drag link and the oil pan. So we are all good there. Now that we've been able to verify that the pan will fit underneath the car, I've got it right here on the table, and I've grabbed the MIG gun on my welder and I started filling in the really large holes. I've had some big ones here, around here. It's just a little windy out right now, and so the wind is getting in here and blowing my gas away and kind of messing up my weld a little bit. But that won't be too much of a hassle. As soon as it's all done, I'll go back over it with my TIG torch and just kind of clean it up a little bit and make sure I got full penetration. But more importantly, make sure I don't have any leaks. I've already taken the liberty to cap off the little corners that we talked about earlier, and I even fixed the one that was on the opposite side that needed the little leg pushed back into it. I just made this one a little bit longer. Then I tack welded the corners and then hit the rest of it down with the hammer, burned it all in, and I was good to go. I'm probably not going to bother to sand this down. I'm just happy that I was able to fill it back in. Alright, so I just finished welding everything up completely with MIG. I actually ran out of wire like around 10 minutes in, and then after that I realized that my settings were completely off. I don't know what ended up happening. I don't remember changing anything on the welder, but this is what I was running before I ran out of wire, and then this is what I was running after I changed the wire. Now it's time to fill this thing up with water to the brim and look and examine and scrutinize every single point of weld that I put on here and make sure that I don't have any kind of leaks whatsoever. It's got to be 100% sealed. Now that I finished up the oil pan, it's time to work on the pickup tube. I have the old pickup tube bolted down here on my junk block, and I've already cut down a little piece of it right here. But the idea is to actually move the oil pickup from here to somewhere over here. The issue now is that if I grab the oil pan and I drop it on top of the engine here, our pickup is 2 1/4 inches too tall. Let's go ahead and remove the pan and see how much 2 1/4 inches is here. So if I line up the top to about 2 1/4, which is about right there, the top has to be here. What I think I'm going to do is I'm going to start here. I'm going to get rid of this neck. This is about 1 inch, 1 1/4 or so, maybe 1.5 inches. Cut it here, cut it there, bring this down to here, and then that'll get me 1 inch, and then I'll probably cut the rest of it out of this part right here, and hopefully that'll get it close enough. All right, so we've taken off about 1 1/4 inches, maybe even a little bit more, and I went ahead and I tack welded the tip of this thing back onto here, and this is what we're looking at right now. I deburred on the inside, got it somewhat clean, or clean enough. And now we're going to go ahead and cut a little bit off of this stem right here, and we're aiming for about 1 inch or so. I've already overlaid the oil pan and we're about 3/4 to 1 inch away. So even if I cut 1 inch out of here because it's at an angle, it's not going to give me that full inch. I'm hoping I'm going to land somewhere in that 3/4. So let's go ahead and cut this, and then we'll super glue it back together. We've temporarily stitched this guy back up right here. So let's go ahead and try out the oil pan one more time. And there we go. Do we line up? What's going on here? So it looks like we're at the correct depth for the pickup tube, but now we're hitting this guy right here, this baffle. So we can either trim the baffle and then the pickup's going to be sitting toward the front, or I can move the entire pickup and scoot it to the back. I think scooting it to the back is going to be a better option because we still need to make the turn around here, and we're going to cut this off anyway. I've now set the back side of the pickup tube right here on the oil pump. I did mark where the old piece ended, and then I marked the 2 areas where the baffles start and where they end. So I have to make sure I'm between this area, hopefully somewhere in the middle. Since we know the tube was hitting here and we want to end up there, all we're going to do is add 1.5 inches to whatever this is. So we're going to take this mark right here and then add 1.5 inches to that, mark it here, cut it, attach the 2 pieces, and that should get us back in the ballpark again. So I've got the pickup tube put back together. It took me a little bit of time to clock it the right way, but I finally got some measurements, and we're sitting at around 6.5 inches from here to the bottom of here, and then if we measure from the top of here to the bottom of there, it's 6 inches. So we are 1/2 inch too tall still, and we've got to trim another 1/2 inch or so from here. All right, so one more time. We are just under 6 inches on this side, just under 6 inches on this side. So we are basically good to go. I think the pickup to pan clearance is supposed to be somewhere between 1/4 inch and 3/8 of an inch. So if I add up the distance of the pan gasket in addition to what I already have now, that should get me right in the ballpark. All there is to do now is to clean up the tube, finish welding it all the way around, and then set up some support so it stops wobbling around. And 1, 2, 3, the pickup is now complete. I reused the old little leg that we saved earlier. Just put a bend here, put another bend up there, and it's completely done. It's completely removable, and it sits perfectly up against the oil pump. So we are all good to go here. Let's go ahead and see if the pan fits up. Okay, so we've got our pan gasket right here, and then we've got our oil pan right here. I don't hear anything. I don't hear any kind of scraping. So at this point, we don't have any kind of interference problems with the pickup. If our math is correct, the pickup should be at a perfect distance away from the bottom of the pan. In the next episode, we're going to take the 5.3 that we're going to use, tear it down, clean it up, and we're going to see what we're actually working with. And with any luck, I'll be able to reuse the motor as is, but hopefully I don't have to go pick up another one. We will find that out in the next episode. I will see you guys all in the next one. Night Wrencher, signing out.